In terms of nutrition recommendations, I like to keep things very simple because most people miss the low-hanging fruit, right? Everybody wants the fancy stuff and they look over the low-hanging fruit.
What is the ultimate morning and nighttime routine to really maximize and sustain fat loss?
Okay, great. That's a fantastic question. First off, let's discuss that the most important thing for fat loss really does come down to energy balance, right? Now, that's the concept of calories in, calories out. And some people like to say that that's a little too overly simplistic. And it's not necessarily overly simplistic, but that is the overarching principle. Now, there's a lot of different variables that will influence each side of that equation, right? And one of those things do come down to nutrient timing when we eat, how we eat throughout the day. And talking about early morning routine, if we talk about it from the context of nutrition, I know fasting is really popular. And I think fasting can be helpful for many people. But if we look at the research literature, breakfast really does seem to be really important, right? Like the most important meal of the day. But the reason being is because it does seem that people that consume breakfast first thing in the morning tend to have greater energy expenditure throughout the day.
Interesting.
Right? So tend to burn more calories. Why? Perhaps because they have a little bit more energy. And two, they tend to have better hunger and satiety regulation. Actually, one of the most important things that I think people need to do for fat loss and sustainable fat loss is looking for ways that they can improve their hunger regulation, their satiety regulation. And one of the most useful strategies, I actually share this with a lot of my clients, is like, hey, let's focus on having a well-balanced breakfast, right? It doesn't need to be any specific type of foods. Ideally, you want to have a relatively high protein breakfast, right? And we can talk about protein a little bit later, but protein is extremely satiating. And also when people talk about losing fat, they want to look fit, right? Which means having some muscle as well. And protein is going to help support those muscle-related goals as well. Aside from protein, I think it's incredibly important to focus on fiber as well. Aside from protein, fiber is extremely satiating as well and has several cardiovascular health benefits as well. So I think a well-rounded breakfast, if we're going to talk about specific foods, breakfast that I eat pretty much daily would be some scrambled eggs. Even though eggs get a lot of hate, we can talk about eggs specifically too. But eggs are a fantastic source of protein, extremely bioavailable, and they're very rich in a number of different micronutrients. So I think eggs are a fantastic way to start the morning. Other protein sources that I like in the morning would be a whey protein, for example, for people that aren't hungry in the morning. I love having Greek yogurt in the morning, perhaps some sort of lean breakfast meat, and then having some sort of fruit. I think most people probably don't like having vegetables in the morning because it's not the most appetizing thing. But having a lean source of protein, having some sort of micronutrients and fiber coming from fruits or vegetables ideally. And then if you're somebody who's an active individual, you're perhaps going to work out throughout the rest of the day. I do think it's important to get a good amount of carbohydrates in the morning as well to fuel yourself throughout the day. So I do think that's an ideal morning ritual from a nutritional standpoint, right? And then from a physical activity component, I mean, ideally, the more you can move your body, the better. I like starting my days with going for a walk. It works for me. I know that I have the luxury of working from home. I make my own schedule so I can do those things, because one of the things that I often get feedback on social media, it's like, well, everybody can't do that, right? And one of the approaches I like to take on social media is being very realistic as well. It's like, we all talk about what is optimal for health. And yeah, there's no doubt that there are things that are optimal for health, but there's also no doubt that a lot of people can't do those things realistically, right? If you are fortunate enough to have 20 or 30 minutes in the morning, going for a walk after your breakfast would be absolutely fantastic. For a lot of people who are overweight, obese, looking to lose fat, a lot of them are insulin resistant as well. And one of the most beneficial things that you can do for regulating insulin and blood sugar is simply going for a walk, getting some movement in after eating. Why? Well, when you eat carbohydrates, obviously you increase blood sugar, increase insulin production. But if you actually walk, obviously when you're walking, the muscles of your legs are contracting. There is an uptake of glucose into the muscle that is independent of insulin. And there's actually really cool research that's showing that going for a 10-minute walk after consuming a meal is equally as effective as metformin for reducing blood sugar postprandially after a meal.
Wow.
So, I like to keep things pretty simple. Well-balanced diet, focus on protein, focus on getting some fiber, ideally from whole foods, hydrate, drink plenty of water, get some physical activity. I think that's a really good starting place for a morning routine.
And why is focusing on protein a better choice than the standard American continental, I guess you could call it breakfast of, the pastry, the bran muffin, the glass of OJ, some of these like cereal, bowl of cereal, these higher carbohydrate, lower protein breakfasts that I think are pretty typical.
Yeah.
of the standard American diet?
Well, from a satiety component, that's one really big benefit of focusing with protein, right? Satiety just means the opposite of hunger, pretty much, if we're going to put it in simple terms. Hungry, you're not satiated. If you're satiated, you're not hungry, right? It's how satisfied are you after a meal? And if we look at the different macronutrients, proteins, carbohydrates, fats, protein has the biggest or the highest satiety effect, right? So if you are somebody who struggles with reducing your food intake, which we know is important for weight loss, if you can have a high protein breakfast, theoretically that should keep you fuller for longer throughout the day, right? So that's one big benefit of protein. Two, from a body composition standpoint, the most important variable when it comes to protein is your total protein intake, right? Second to that would be protein timing. So let's say if we're going to talk about general protein recommendations, if we look at the literature from a body composition standpoint, you want to consume at least 1.6 grams per kilogram of body weight. Kilogram, 2.2 pounds. I weigh about 220 pounds. I try to consume at least 160 grams of protein. That's actually quite a lot of protein. That's a lot more protein than most people actually consume. And if you don't prioritize it at every meal, it's actually really hard to get your total protein intake in, right? That's something that a lot of my clients struggle with. It's like they go throughout their day and then they notice they haven't eaten enough protein at the end of the day. It's hard to get 100 grams in a meal. So it's important to consume protein at each meal for that reason as well, to get your total protein intake. But then if we're going to talk a little bit more nuanced about protein and talk about protein timing, well, one of the big benefits of protein for stimulating muscle growth is that it stimulates what we call muscle protein synthesis, right? That's just the process by which we grow muscle. And so you consume protein, it stimulates muscle protein synthesis. So rates of muscle protein synthesis are elevated and they typically return back to baseline within 4 to 6 hours. So in theory, you want to be consuming an adequate amount of protein every 4 to 6 hours or so, right? And if you are consuming 3 or 4 meals per day, ideally you're having a good bolus of protein at each of those meals. A good bolus for most people is going to be about 30 grams of protein. That's, I'd say, fair for the general population. Most people probably get 10 or 15 grams, which is like half of that, right?
Wow.
So yeah, with the protein timing thing, I mentioned that total protein is the most important thing and timing is second to that, because when we do look at the literature from a body composition standpoint, it does seem that people that consume adequate total protein, the timing isn't that important, right? Like, let's say you only have 2 meals, they're 12 hours apart, you still get your total protein intake. It doesn't seem to adversely affect how your body composition responds to resistance training, for example, or fat loss, right? So that's why I'm weary when I talk about these things, because it's like, I don't want to put them on the same pedestal. Total protein is the most important by far.
It's like the Pareto principle where like 80% of the effort should go into your making sure that you're hitting that number, whatever that number is for you. And then like, if you really want to split hairs at the end of the day, then you can start worrying about timing. But don't worry about timing unless you're getting adequate protein.
But the timing aspect, aside from the muscle protein synthesis thing, is if you don't focus on timing, it's really hard to consume an adequate amount of total protein.
So you just want to make sure that it's like evenly
spaced out.
Got it.
So whatever your protein goal is, right? Maybe if we're going to talk about practical recommendations here, the RDA for protein is about 0.08 grams per pound of body weight, which is about half of what you should be consuming for body composition related goals. Most people meet that. Most people are not deficient in protein, right? The RDA is really set to prevent deficiencies.
It's 0.8 grams per kilogram, right?
My apologies. Yes, per kilogram. 0.8 per pound would essentially be the 1.6.
Yeah.
Right. So 0.8 grams per kilogram, which is very little protein. For me, that's about 80 grams of protein. It's nothing, right? So
what would happen if you started eating the RDA's recommended amount? Would you like, you would experience more hunger throughout the day? Would you not, like, would you lose muscle? Like what would that look like?
So I guess in theory, we could say, I'm not sure if somebody who has already spent years resistance training would necessarily lose muscle, but I would assume that you would definitely respond way less to building further muscle or improving your body composition further. Because there is very, very clear evidence that 1.6 grams is better than the RDA for building muscle. Beyond 1.6, it's negligible. And in some niche situations, it may be smart to go above 1.6 grams. Like the typical bodybuilding recommendations, 1 gram per pound, right? Which is 2.2 grams per kilo. I'd say for people who are trying to lose body fat, that may be helpful because there are, again, satiety-inducing benefits, right? And then you can also argue that when you are in a weight loss phase, which is a catabolic state, you're losing tissue, you may need slightly higher protein to preserve the amount of muscle mass that you have. Now, again, I say that with an asterisk because most people who are just starting off don't need to worry about that. If you're just starting to improve your health, you're just starting on learning about resistance training to build muscle, these are such novel stimuli that you're going to respond, even if your protein intake isn't optimal, right? And somebody who hasn't taken care of their health at all, lifting alone, even if they have very poor like protein intake, they're going to build muscle, right? And that's really where like the nuanced topics are hard to get across, because I get people ask me questions all the time. They're like, oh, well, I'm cutting, will I lose muscle mass? That's a big one, right? It's like, well, it depends on all of these different variables. Yeah. But in essence, if somebody is relatively new, and by relatively new, you could be lifting for a year or 2 years, still be pretty new, you're not really going to lose muscle mass if you're losing body fat, if perhaps your protein intake isn't optimal, but you could get better results if you focus on these things.
Amazing. Yeah. And it's like the more overweight you are, the more you can get away with not just like lower protein, not that we want to go low protein, but a lower on that protein continuum. And you can get away with also, I think, a higher, like a more rapid weight loss, right? Like a greater calorie deficit.
Yep. And this is something I've experienced anecdotally with clients too. You tend to get those. I want to be careful here because obviously some people who are overweight or obese experience extreme hunger like all the time, right? And that's where some of these semaglutide medications have been really beneficial for people. I have a client in particular who is obese. His whole life, he's really struggled with his weight. And he recently started taking semaglutide. It's the first time in his life he's been able to see something and just be like, I don't want it. Which is really powerful, right? Because perhaps you and I can't relate to that type of experience where like he shared with me that he literally could not eat something or he couldn't refrain from eating something if he saw it, right? Whereas for you and I, perhaps if we're full, like, oh, it's okay. Like it looks good. I don't need it, right? So except for those situations, in general, the leaner you already are, the more you're going to feel negative impacts of being in a calorie deficit and attempting to lose weight, right? And maybe we should quickly define what a calorie deficit is here. Just eating less calories from your food than your body expends, right? You burn calories doing nothing, right? Your metabolic rate, your body requires energy just to keep you alive. And then everything you do, physical activity, regulating your temperature, all requires energy, right? So if you consume less energy than your body expends, you lose weight. Why? Because if you're eating 2,000 calories, body expends 2,500 calories. It still needs to get those 500 calories from somewhere. If it's not coming from your food, it's going to come from stored sources like body fat. It'll come from other sources too, but to keep it simple, it'll come from body fat, right? So with experiencing negative side effects of weight loss like hunger, satiety, loss of muscle mass, those negative effects really only become apparent once you're already pretty lean, right? Like Max, you're a healthy guy. If you tried getting absolutely shredded for a bodybuilding competition, you would experience these side effects to a much greater degree than somebody who is overweight or obese and is just trying to improve their health. And that type of person would also be able to lose weight at a much faster rate because they have excess adiposity compared to somebody like you. And they probably wouldn't have any detrimental effects, right? You can argue that somebody who is overweight or obese who follows a standard American diet, for example, who starts to improve their dietary behaviors, focusing more on whole foods, focusing more on protein, fiber. In terms of nutrition recommendations, I like to keep things very simple because most people miss the low-hanging fruit, right? Everybody wants the fancy stuff and they look over the low-hanging fruit. But somebody who just starts to eat more whole foods, has a regular meal schedule, that's a big one too. Starts focusing, eating breakfast, lunch, and dinner at routine times, focuses more on protein, focuses more on fiber. They'll probably feel more satiated and improve their health and improve their overall body composition without experiencing any of these side effects. Right? So when we talk about loss of muscle mass with weight loss, that's only really apparent first for people who already have a ton of muscle mass and are already very lean to begin with.
Yeah, I so appreciate that nuance. And I think it's important and it's often overlooked. Like I've always said that, for example, like with regard to calorie tracking, that like somebody who's like really overweight, like probably like I think that you can get to and this is where maybe like my bias comes through, but I believe that generally by optimizing for all these things that you're talking about, which I've said in the past too, like the value of protein, that you really ought to be able to get to like a healthy weight within like a healthy range, just doing those things. Yeah. But that's where like then you get the utility of, which is actually a very powerful tool, calorie tracking and like, these more nuanced details to go from like lean within a healthy range to like shredded. Like you might need to use those sort of higher order tools to get shredded, but you shouldn't need them to be like within a normal healthy range.
No, you definitely don't need them. Now, I think there's something very powerful about learning about calories and learning how to track your calories for, let's say, 3 to 6 months. Because somebody who's never focused on their nutrition, if I put a plate of food in front of you, they'd have a really hard time telling you whether that's perhaps too much, too little, right? Because you and I understand that some foods are calorie dense. So although the volume isn't much, it could be very calorically dense, right? And the opposite is true too. You could have a salad with a bunch of salad dressing and it'll be very calorie dense. And somebody who has never focused on those things, it's like, oh, that's a salad, it's healthy. And in theory, it is healthy, right? But the caloric content still matters. And I also think that tracking your calories for a period of time allows you to develop an intuitive sense of what's too much, what's too little, how to make appropriate substitutions, right? So with many of my clients, I do like having them learn about calorie tracking, at least for 3 months, alongside working on behavior change. I think behavior change is the key, right? But calorie tracking is just a skill and a tool that I think opens your eyes to a lot of things that you don't learn unless you do it. Now, when you mentioned that you don't need to track calories, you don't, right? Like I mentioned, I think it's useful. You don't need to track calories. But if we look at the traits of healthy people, I do think it's important to track something, right? Because let's say somebody who's overweight or obese doesn't want to track their calories, but they want to focus on these behaviors like eating more whole foods. Well, they still have to maybe set certain goals of like, how many servings of fruits and veggies am I going to consume per day, right? And then I have regular meal times. These are things that you're tracking, even though you're not tracking specific numbers like you would with calories. You have to maybe track your body weight once a week, stuff like that. So at the end of the day, for weight loss, for improving health, some restriction has to occur. Right? And there's really good research on this where like, if something feels overly restrictive, it's harder to adhere to, but some form of restriction is necessary. And what I tell my clients is like, let's play around with these different forms of tracking essentially, and let's find what feels less restrictive to you. Because everybody's slightly different. I might like tracking calories. Somebody else might like tracking behaviors, right? At the end of the day, we're tracking something. We're restricting some other things. But the method that you choose to achieve your goals should feel the least restrictive to you personally.
Yeah. What about there was that seminal Kevin Hall study where they put people in a super controlled environment.
Metabolic ward.
Metabolic. Was it a metabolic ward where they?
I believe all his studies are pretty much metabolic ward studies.
So it was like ad libitum feeding. They gave it was like a crossover trial. They gave the participants like access to this like ultra processed food environment, right? They ended up eating at a calorie surplus to satiety of about 300 calories over. It was either in that range of like 300 to 500 calories over. But then when they improved the food quality, and all they gave them access to were minimally processed foods. They saw them like without tracking come in effortlessly at like a calorie deficit.
So I believe this was a 2015 study published by Kevin Hall. I reference this study all the time, dude, when I talk about processed foods.
Good study.
Fantastic study. And it really goes to show, it really highlights what the quote unquote negative effects of highly processed foods are, right? Because what I try to tell my clients is like, hey, obviously we eat for our health, but there's more to eating than just your health, right? Enjoying time with friends and just overall satisfaction too. Like, I don't think there's anything wrong with eating a donut if the reason you're having it is because I enjoy it and I want it, right? The same way, why am I watching this movie tonight? Because I enjoy it, right? So we do things for satisfaction. So that's an important aspect to talk about too, because I think for overall health, mental health is important too, right? And there are people that can avoid some of those foods altogether, but some people enjoy them. I enjoy them on a regular basis. And so what you really need to find is balance between how many whole foods you consume and how many of those fun foods you can include in your diet, right? Now, going back to the Kevin Hall study, essentially what they did was take participants in a very controlled environment, like you mentioned. A metabolic ward is like the gold standard of metabolism research, energy expenditure, et cetera, because you can control every single variable, right? Most studies with large groups of people are free living studies, right? And this is where we get into like the research method stuff, and people are so critical because they don't understand what the cost of stuff is or the logistics. It's like, if you're going to do a study with 100, 200 people, you can't have them in a metabolic ward. It's really expensive. And it's hard to have people like volunteer to stay at a place for 3 or 5 days, right? So usually large cohort studies are free living studies. The unfortunate side of that is that there's not much control. Now you have these studies with 15, 20 participants that can be done in a metabolic ward, and they're way more controlled, but the sample size is smaller, right? So the power of the results is not as powerful as like a larger sample size. Nonetheless, they took these participants, fed them an ad libitum diet. Ad libitum means eat as much as you want. And the main difference between the two diets was one was mainly non-processed foods, whole foods, right? Examples, apples, lean protein, rice, beans, potatoes, etc. Or a diet that is an ultra-processed diet. So the term ultra-processed, foods are not either processed or unprocessed. Processing exists on a spectrum. Technically, anything we do to a food is processing, right? If we cut an apple, you have technically processed it, right? So we can talk about a spectrum here. Completely unprocessed apple, right? Slightly more processed apple slices. Apple sauce, apple juice, gummy flavored apple, right? Gummy flavored apple would be the ultra processed version. So the ultra processed diet was exactly that, an ultra processed diet. But the really cool thing is that they matched for calories presented, okay? They matched for macronutrients, sodium, and fiber. I apologize if I missed some nutrients there, but they accounted for those. So the diets, one was whole and processed foods, one was ultra processed foods, but they had the same amount of calories, protein, macronutrients, fiber, sodium, etc. And exactly what you mentioned, when they followed the ultra processed diet group, they on average ate 500 calories more per day, right? Why? This is what I like to tell my clients, like ultra processed foods are engineered to be delicious. They're hard to put down. And that's their purpose. Like that's what they're made for, right? Food companies, you can't blame them, want to sell as much of their product as possible. If you sell potato chips and I sell potato chips, and my potato chips taste better than your potato chips, I'm going to make more money, right? Yeah. So there are like millions, if not billions of dollars, I don't know the exact dollar amount, of money invested into just engineering better tasting foods, right? And if you have foods that are salty, crunchy, fatty, they're going to be really hard to put down, right? So yes, the macronutrient profile of these foods may be the same, but the combination of the particular food is not, right? Like an apple compared to, for example, you may have an apple and you may have some nuts, right? You have the same amount of fiber, fat, and carbohydrate. But you have a potato chip, which is carbohydrate and fat and salt in the same bite, and that combination is really hard to put down. So that really, in my opinion, is the biggest negative side effect of consuming a lot of ultra-processed foods. It's that they're just really easy to overeat, and they tend to be very calorie dense as well. A lot of unprocessed foods contain a lot of water, right? There's also really good research showing that water has some sort of satiating effect. People that tend to have a glass of water like this one before a meal, on average, consume 150 to 200 calories less in that meal, right? So if you're having things like a lot of fruits obviously have a lot of water, a lot of vegetables have a lot of water, that's going to be satiating on its own. A lot of ultra-processed foods don't contain that water component, right? So that's really what I see as the biggest negative effects of consuming a ton of ultra-processed foods.
Well, you're saying that, I mean, generally that you have to, if you're not happy with your body composition, if you're overweight, if you're obese, you're going to have to restrict something. So in this study, what they did was they restricted access to ultra-processed foods, and they saw their, the participants effortlessly essentially enter this calorie deficit. But if you want to integrate some proportion of ultra-processed fun foods into your diet, which can help with diet adherence, right? Which is like probably the most important variable in terms of like sustainable weight loss, then you're going to have to just be mindful of the fact that these foods are inherently tend to be more calorie dense, tend to be hyper palatable.
Yeah. And maybe that type of person is the type of person that would prefer to track the calories. Right. And I think it's very silly for us to say that one approach is better than the other.
Right.
Because at the end of the day, different approaches work for different people.
So would you say that the higher the degree generally of processing in one's diet, the more likely it's going to be that calorie tracking is going to be a necessity for that person?
Yes, but that person should also focus on changing those food behaviors if they are overweight or obese, right? I saw a video recently and it was very nicely put. They were like, you can lose weight eating shitty foods, but you're going to feel like shit.
Yeah.
Just from like a hunger perspective alone, right? Like those foods don't make you feel full.
Well, there's always that like viral meme that goes around about some nutrition professor somewhere wanted to
Yes.
demonstrate to their students that they could lose weight on an all
Yes.
Twinkie diet or something like that.
Yep. I think it's Mark Hobb. I might have his first name wrong, but his last name was Hobb, Haub. And it's called the Twinkie diet, a famous experiment. And what he did was he didn't just eat Twinkies, he just ate ultra processed foods, counted his calories. Essentially, he wanted to prove to people that ultra processed foods do not inherently cause weight gain, because that is a fear that a lot of people have, right?
Yeah.
They're like, man, if I exercise and eat really well, but if I have that donut, it's going to cause me to gain weight. That's not necessarily true. So this professor wanted to show that you could lose weight following an ultra processed diet. He also supplemented with sufficient protein and supplemented with particular nutrients to make sure he's not deficient in any micronutrients. So he was taking a multivitamin, some other specific nutrients, consuming protein supplementation, and the majority of his diet was like Twinkies, donuts, stuff like that. He lost weight, and all his blood biomarkers improved as well because he was overweight. So his blood biomarkers improved, right? Triglycerides, cholesterol, glycemic control, which very, very, very nicely demonstrates that your body weight and your body fat percentage in particular is a huge determinant of your overall health.
Interesting.
Right? Because we want to think that like, oh, it's just about eating healthy. And eating healthy is important. But and people might hate me when I say this, but it does come second to your body fat percentage. If you have excess adiposity, losing body fat will improve your health. Why? Because we usually don't think of fat as an active tissue that really does much in our body, right? We just like, oh, we have fat there, it's excess energy. But fat is actually an endocrine organ. What does that mean? Endocrine hormone systems, right? So you have different tissues in your body that secrete different hormones. Your fat cells secrete hormone-like molecules. And when you are overweight, because of certain anatomical changes to the fat tissue, I won't get too specific into that, but essentially the secretory profile of the adipose tissues, of the adipose cells changes, right? You have more inflammatory cytokines. Cytokines are just molecules that we secrete. Things like TNF alpha, interleukin 6. Some people may have heard of those. So when you are overweight or obese, you release more of those. And those inflammatory molecules are linked to the development of cardiovascular disease, atherosclerosis in particular. They directly inhibit insulin signaling, right? That's why like being overweight or obese is the number one contributing factor to some of these diseases. It's because the fat itself is contributing to the development of these diseases, right? And then most people who tend to be overweight or obese are also relatively physically inactive, so they may have low muscle mass, and muscle mass actually has an opposite effect, right? Where we're actually secreting molecules that have positive effects on our health. That's why I really think to improve your health, the main things you should focus on are improving body composition, reducing body fat to a point because you don't want to have no body fat either, and optimizing muscle mass as much as possible through resistance training. I really do think that is the basis of improving our health. And then other factors like consuming particular foods or focusing on particular food groups comes second to that, because that will have the biggest effect on your health.
Well, I mean, I definitely agree, but just to like play devil's advocate,
Sure.
I mean, aren't there, and I'm sure people that are listening to this, watching this, know people that have been relatively lean their whole lives and still develop chronic health conditions.
Yes. And we can talk about the term normal weight obese. Have you heard of that before?
Yeah.
It's essentially being under-muscled. It's like your weight is normal.
Skinny fat.
Exactly. But your body composition isn't optimal, right? And that's why I don't like to use the terms weight and body fat interchangeably, because they're not, right? You can be normal weight and be metabolically unhealthy. And again, that's because those people are under-muscled, right? I think we focus a lot on body fat and tend not to focus as much on muscle mass. And it's equally important to focus on improving muscle mass. And it's not just muscle, it's physical activity, right? A lot of the people that you're mentioning that are normal weight perhaps develop some of these chronic diseases. There's a genetic component. We can't disagree about that, right? There's a genetic component. 2, they're likely very physically inactive, are under-muscled. And then 3, food choices do matter, right? Like we were talking about. If you have high blood lipids, high cholesterol, consuming more fiber is going to be helpful, right? So there are definitely dietary changes that can be beneficial if somebody has a particular condition or a particular risk factor. But I'd say for the general person who is overweight or obese, simply losing some body fat, improving physical function, working on improving a little bit of muscle mass will have the biggest benefit for your health for sure.
Yeah. So it's like somebody listening to this who's just getting started, like, and wondering what that first step should be.
Yeah.
Especially if they're overweight, particularly if they're overweight, it should be getting not overweight.
Yes. And actually, let's talk about this, how to take steps towards that, right? Because this is what I do with my clients. I have people who come to me and they're like, I've tried everything under the sun, can't lose weight, fallen into every single fad diet. And one recurring theme I see amongst many people is that they try to do too much at once, right? My coaching really is like a simple habits approach.
How lucky are your clients to have like a PhD coach?
I guess they're pretty lucky. I'm pretty lucky that I have awesome clients too, to be honest. I have a conversation with everybody that I work with before I work with them just to make sure that we're a good fit. But one of the biggest downfalls, or one of the biggest things that people do that essentially they're shooting themselves in the foot, is that they try to tackle too much at once. And I can share even personal experience from family members, right? My wife's uncle, he reached out to me and he was like, pretty overweight. He's like, next week, keep in mind, he does zero physical activity. Next week, I'm going to start doing Orange Theory twice a day for six times a week. And I was like, you're not going to do that.
Twice a day?
Twice a day, 6 times a week. All right. So he was just going to go from 0 to 100, literally. And so I asked him, I was like, well, what are you going to do after you lose the weight? And his answer was literally, I'm going to stop. And I was like, well, what do you think is going to happen? And I asked him, what do you think is a sustainable amount that you could do forever? Could you do 2 times a week? And he's like, oh yeah, but I don't want to do that. That's the issue people have, right? So when I work with somebody who has tried many things in the past and failed, usually, obviously we talk about their diet, we talk about their daily habits, and then we identify very small little things that they can change. And then I ask them, which of these seems most realistic to implement first? Because I think something that is very powerful is when the person identifies it themselves, right? Like, these are my options. I could perhaps walk a little bit more. I could perhaps change up these things I'm having with my breakfast for better healthy choices. But I don't want to tell the person what to do. I ask them which one seems more realistic, which one seems easiest, and we start with implementing 1 habit per week, right? I usually do 1 nutrition-related habit, 1 exercise-related habit. And when they're compliant with that for about 2 weeks, then we just add a little bit to it. It's not a sexy approach. It's not nearly as sexy as like, oh, lose 30 pounds in 30 days or anything like that, but it works. I've had success with clients time and time again using this approach because it's realistic and it builds momentum. I think that one's huge, right? Usually when we do something, we want to achieve something, we fail, we feel really bad about it. We feel bad about ourselves. We're not working hard enough. We're not committed enough. And usually that's not the issue. It's just the approach you're taking is not appropriate, right? And so when you do these small habits, you start to stack small wins. You feel more confident in yourself and you feel more confident in your abilities. And it opens possibilities for you to do more, right? For example, with some clients who are completely sedentary and perhaps they're very overweight, very obese, one of the main habits that I like to work with them on, it's like, listen, just go for a 5-minute walk. That is very doable for everybody, right? I'm going to say, we're going to set daily minimums. Not even like this is your target for the day. We're going to set a daily minimum that's non-negotiable. That's the word I like to use, non-negotiable. And you tell me what's non-negotiable for you. Oh, 5 minutes is non-negotiable. I can do that. What usually happens, they walk for 15, 20, 25 minutes. Because if you go through the trouble of putting on exercise clothes, right? Putting on your sneakers and you get outside, you're going to walk for more than 5 minutes. But when they walk for 15, 20 minutes and they feel really good because they only technically had to do 5 minutes, they're like, wow, I'm actually getting good at this, right? So that's really the approach I like to take with most clients. And I think that's the approach that most people should really take when it comes to improving their health, right? Determine what are the things that you should change. Don't change them all at once. Pick one, be patient, adhere to it for a week or 2, and then add the second one, add the third one, add the fourth one. And a year from now, your habits and behaviors are completely different than what they were a year ago, right? I like this quote a lot. I don't know if I came up with it or I heard it somewhere. It's a combination of things I've heard. But the way your health and the way your body looks physically is just a delayed reflection of your daily habits, right? The things you do every single day impact your health and impact your physique. And people don't want to admit that, right? They want hacks, etc. And again, some of these hack things may have some very small benefits. But like we were talking about earlier, picking the low-hanging fruit, these things are going to give you the biggest bang for your buck. They're just not sexy. So people don't want to do them.
It's crazy, yeah. Because what's sexy sells, especially on social
media.
Yeah. But I love this, like from a nutritional standpoint, what would you say would be like an ideal first place to start? I love the whole breakfast thing, like just changing your breakfast.
Yep.
Like you don't even have to like revamp your kitchen.
No.
Like just change your breakfast.
The biggest thing I think for most people, and again, I'm biased here because most of the people I work with have body composition related goals, is protein. Most people just like don't eat enough protein. And the reason why I think protein is a good place to start is because it has a trickling effect, right? It keeps you full. You're going to naturally reduce the amount of other foods that you eat. That's another thing I like to talk to my clients about. It's like, rather than having a restrictive mindset and focusing on the things you should remove, because for example, a lot of people have a hard time with overeating at night, right before bed. They snack a ton, right? And they know they shouldn't, but when they don't, they fixate on it, and then they just go back to that behavior. So rather than focusing on the things we should eliminate, let's focus on the things we should add, right? And when we have this mentality of like, we need to add these things to our diet, I should eat more of this, I should have more vegetables, I should have more protein, you are going to inherently do less of the other behaviors without having to hyper-focus on them, right? And that's an approach that I take with my clients that has had a lot of success. So for example, for clients that tend to overeat a lot at night, one very, very simple thing I tell them, because a lot of clients work late nights, they come home, there's no food prepared, right? We can talk about like planning ahead of time, but some people just like don't. So I'm like, all right, let's have a snack that is very satiating. Usually what I recommend is a scoop of whey protein powder with about 16 ounces of water, because proteins can be satiating. The volume from the water is going to cause gastric stretching, which tells your brain that you've had a lot of volume, so it's going to induce some satiety. And usually have a piece of fruit that has some fiber with that as well. And then I tell them, wait 15 minutes. And if you still want to have some snacks, feel free. What usually happens, they either don't have the snack or they have a lot less of the snack, right? My goal with most of my clients is not to completely eliminate behaviors, because eliminating behaviors is very difficult. I try to reduce behaviors by adding healthy behaviors. And that, at least from my experience, has been a very, very, very helpful approach.
I feel like for somebody who's naive to like the fitness world, having them go out and like buy a protein shake probably seems like a weird thing to have in their kitchen, you know?
Yeah. People think protein powder is like something else.
Yeah, for like bodybuilders.
Yeah.
But it's great. It's a staple in my diet.
Yeah. I mean, like we mentioned, most people don't get enough protein. It's a very easy way to get protein. And whey protein, contrary to what a lot of people think, is very healthy. Right? Here's where we talk about like processing, right? Processed food doesn't inherently mean bad, because whey protein is very processed. Whey protein is extremely processed, right? But it's very good for you. And again, it's just an easy way to get very bioavailable, high quality protein. Bioavailable means that your body can use most of it. High quality meaning the amino acid profile, right? We have different amino acids. Amino acids make up proteins. They are what we call essential amino acids that we need to get from our diet. Whey protein is really high in those. Whey protein is really high in particular in one amino acid called leucine, which is the main amino acid that stimulates muscle protein synthesis, muscle growth. And that's why whey protein is so popular through like the bodybuilding community, I guess.
Yeah, huge fan. What about there's this conception, maybe it's a misconception, which you can help debunk, that we can only absorb or utilize a certain amount of protein per meal.
Yeah, that's not true, right? You can absorb. So there's a difference between absorption and what you use that protein for, right? So absorption literally just means that your body absorbs it from your intestines into your bloodstream. You can theoretically consume 1,000 grams of protein and absorb nearly the 1,000 grams. It's just that all that protein is not going to be used. And when we talk about using protein, most people are talking about building muscle, right? So the muscle protein synthesis response does seem to be maxed out at about 30 grams of protein for most people, right? So if you consume 30 grams of protein, you're going to max out that we'll just call it MPS, muscle protein synthesis response. You'll max out MPS. Now, if you eat more protein, you still absorb it, right? You can use protein for energy production. You can use protein for other biological processes. And so people are like, should I eat more than 30 grams in one sitting? And it really depends, right? Because if you're a larger person like myself, I probably have about 50 grams of protein in a sitting. And again, those satiating benefits are still there on top of consuming 25, 30 grams for muscle growth. Now, I say that 30 grams is sufficient for most people because in some situations it's not, right? As we age, there's a phenomenon called anabolic resistance, which means that we just don't respond as well to the same dose of protein. And there's really cool research on this too, showing if you take a young person and an older person, let's say above 60, below 30, the anabolic response that a 20-year-old will get from 25 grams of protein will be almost twice as that as somebody who's in their 60s. And the person who's in their 60s can get the same anabolic response if they just increase their protein intake, right? So again, this is why when we were talking about general recommendations, the 1.6 grams per kilo is a great general recommendation. But if you're older, perhaps you should increase that slightly. If you are lean, attempting weight loss, perhaps increase that slightly. And if you tend to find yourself really hungry throughout the day, well, I would say 1.6 grams is probably pretty helpful for satiation. But if that 1.6 grams is more than 30 grams per serving, feel free to have more than 30 grams per serving. It's still going to have benefits, right? You're not just going to excrete it and it goes to waste. Your body's still going to use it and it's still going to have those satiating benefits for sure.
Well, I mean, it goes back to what you said earlier, that the sum total amount of grammage of protein that you get over the course of the day is ultimately what matters most.
Yes.
Very interesting. What about, so for people that are on weight loss diets, there's this concept of like metabolic adaptation, adaptive thermogenesis. Can you unpack those concepts for us?
Sure. So metabolic adaptation. So your metabolism, again, your metabolic rate, is in theory how much energy your body burns at rest, right? If I were to sit here like a vegetable, not talk, not do anything, I'm burning calories, right? That is your metabolic rate. A big determinant of your metabolic rate is your weight. Right? A bigger person just burns more energy than a smaller person. Now,
is that because they're carrying more muscle?
Just more weight in general too. Like if I walk from here to there and I weigh 200 pounds, it's going to require more energy than somebody who weighs 120 pounds, right? Think about if you were to push a 200-pound sled. It requires more energy, more force output. Similar type of concept, right? So the whole idea is that as you lose weight, your metabolism does decrease, right? Because you're weighing less. And there are some other changes in physiology as well that contribute to changes in metabolic rate, but the main thing is changes in body weight. Now, metabolic adaptation is this idea that your metabolic rate decreases more than it should based off of how much weight you lose, right? Let's say my metabolic rate is 2,000 calories at rest. I weigh 200 pounds. I drop weight to 180 pounds. My metabolic rate should decrease, in theory, random numbers here, to 1,700. Now, if it drops to 1,500, that is metabolic adaptation. I will say this, the evidence to support metabolic adaptation is not super strong. And it comes down to some methodological issues with research, okay? And the reason I bring this up, and actually Lane and I discussed this in detail, there was this one study. So most studies go through a weight loss period and then measure metabolism immediately after the period of weight loss, right? And there are studies showing that there's some metabolic adaptation there, right? Now, when you simply put that person on maintenance for about 2 weeks and then measure the metabolic rate, it seems like the metabolic adaptation doesn't exist. It exists to a very small degree, 20, 30 calories perhaps, which is in some ways relatively negligible and can also be perhaps error in measurements, okay? There's also a really cool study showing, they took patients that underwent gastric bypass and lost like 40 or 50 pounds. And all the changes in metabolism, the changes in energy expenditure were almost 100% explained by changes in body weight, right? So I know that metabolic adaptation is one of the reasons people say that they struggle with weight loss or whatnot. And some people may have really low energy expenditure due to some physiological anomalies like low thyroid hormone production, for example. But most people, their metabolism is not damaged because they attempted weight loss. Your energy expenditure does decrease. And now some people use the term metabolic adaptation just to say that their metabolism decreased. That's not by definition what metabolic adaptation means, right? Metabolic adaptation means that it decreased more than it should have. That definition of metabolic adaptation, there really isn't super strong evidence to support it. And that's actually a good thing, right? Because it means that people can actually attempt weight loss. And if they fail to do so or have spent years yo-yo dieting, it doesn't mean that their metabolism is damaged. It doesn't mean that their energy expenditure isn't low. Some people do have really low energy expenditure, but it doesn't mean that dieting itself or weight loss damages your metabolism in any way.
Fascinating. So for somebody that wants to sustain weight loss, you just have to be mindful of the fact that as you are reducing weight, you are also going to concurrently need to consider your new weight.
Yes.
And adjust your calories accordingly.
Yes. And this is why I love to focus on building muscle through resistance training because muscle is metabolically active. If you have more muscle, your energy expenditure is higher, right? So if we can focus on increasing your physical activity, increasing muscle mass, then you don't have to decrease how much you eat nearly as much, right? And that's why when people try to take this approach of weight loss where it's just nutrition, it's like, not good. Or just exercise, not good. You need both of them. I'd rather you do 50-50 and put less effort into each than go 100% into one of them because it's just not going to be nearly as effective.
Is there a rough and dirty way to estimate one's calorie needs? I've heard like you can use like a simple formula like your body weight times 15 for like a sense of maintenance. And these are again estimates, but like, times 15 for maintenance times, roughly 11 or 12 to figure out what a calorie deficit may be for you.
Yeah. Those numbers are I think the numbers that are used for rough estimates. I can't say exactly because I don't use that approach. I do like using like not testing, but estimating your basal metabolic rate, and then based on your level of physical activity, estimating what your maintenance would be.
There are those formulas, right? Like
yeah. There's some formulas that take into account like your body weight, your sex, your level of leanness, your age, and they spit out a value.
Easily like Googleable. People can find them.
Exactly.
Calorie calculators
and
stuff.
Just Google basal metabolic rate calculator. Now, those numbers are rough estimates. This is all rough estimates, right? Like none of this is exact, but it's going to give you a general ballpark. The most accurate way, this is what I usually tell my clients, is just track your calories for a week. See how many calories you consume. If you've been weight stable, that's probably more or less your maintenance. I don't like the rough numbers because it doesn't take into account body composition at all, right? So and it doesn't take into account physical activity. So if you're really, really physically active, you may consume more than 15 calories per pound, right? I know I do. If you're not physically active and you eat 15 calories per pound, you might actually gain weight, right? So that's why I don't like those rough numbers too much. I think, again, they're just a good starting point, right? So if somebody listening to this perhaps wants to learn how to track their calories, wants to start, I actually have a really fantastic video on YouTube on how to track your calories because I've seen all these YouTube videos on like the importance of tracking your calories and none of them actually teach you how to do it. So if you guys just search up my name, Dr. Joey Muñoz on YouTube, I have a video on there on how to track your calories if you're interested in learning. And either you use 15 calories per pound or you use one of these equations. It's just a starting place. And then you have to tailor that over time to figure out where you should be at.
Dope. I didn't realize you had a YouTube channel. That's awesome.
Dude, so we can talk about that more. I started YouTube just because I wanted to do more long form content than I do on Instagram. And everything I do is scripted. And so I was just spending so much time scripting videos. And that's why we'll talk more about this too. That's why I'm going to do the podcast because I just feel like it's a lot more natural having conversation versus like reading word for word from a teleprompter.
Love it. What about this concept of refeeds when dieting? What is a refeed?
Okay.
Are they important? Like, break it down.
Yeah. So there are some technical terms here between like refeed, cheat day, cheat meal, etc. I don't like getting into the hyper specifics of which one is which because it like really doesn't matter much. But essentially a refeed just means you eat more on a particular day or a particular time frame, right? Some people will do refeeds for a week. Some people will do them for a weekend, a day. And essentially what it is, refeeds are like if you are losing weight, you're in a calorie deficit, refeed, you just go to maintenance for a period of time. The absolute biggest benefit of a refeed is psychological. It's just giving you a break from dieting. And this is where we talk about like different approaches work for different people. And within like the calorie counting people, within the people that like counting their calories, there's different approaches to tracking your calories too, right? Like for example, let's say you are going to diet for 12 weeks, right? And your maintenance is X number of calories. Well, some people will rather have a slight calorie deficit of 200 or 300 calories and sustain that for 12 weeks. Some people hate that. Some people rather go really hard for a week and then chill for a week. And there's really good evidence that both of those methods are effective. And again, the one that you like more should be the one that you choose, right? There is no like magical benefit of a refeed that's going to result in significantly better body composition after the diet, right? The main benefit is psychological. You take a little break from dieting, you go back to maintenance. Maybe it helps you regroup psychologically and helps you adhere a little bit better the next week. That's really the biggest benefit of refeeds. I use them with my clients only if they feel like they're burnt out from dieting, right? Because the worst thing you can do is like feel burnt out from dieting and then feel like a failure. And then your answer is, I need to diet harder. It's like, hey, that's not working, right? Maybe you should just take a break for a week. And people tend to hyperfixate on just like where they're failing, right? Because this is something I experience with clients. They may have started at X weight, already lost 20 or 30 pounds, but now they're struggling and they want to lose more weight. They're like, oh, I feel like a failure. I can't get past this weight. It's like, hey, you've already come so far. How about we just take a break from dieting for 2 or 3 weeks, right? I think these refeeds or diet breaks, which in my perspective are very like interchangeable terms, are really useful when people have like perhaps a period of time in their life where they have birthday parties, celebrations, vacations. It's like, hey, just chill out, have a break from your diet for a couple of weeks. You're not going to lose your progress. And then you can come back, you're mentally fresh, you're not burnt out, and you can diet hard again, essentially, right? It's the same concept with lifting, right? Have you heard of the concept of deload weeks with training?
No.
So a deload week is essentially a week where you purposely train really easily to allow your body to recover and dissipate fatigue from training. So if you're training for hypertrophy, you have to train really hard, right? You have to push your muscles near failure. Well, if you do that consistently with sufficient volume for 6 to 8 weeks, you're going to feel pretty beat up, right? And there's actually cool research on this too. Implementing a deload, which is where you perhaps train with half of the volume and half of the intensity, actually potentiates long-term gains because you're allowing your body to recover properly, right? Whereas if you just continue to hammer training, you can still train, but you probably won't make progress optimally. And you might experience more risk of injury, etc. So that concept of deloading is kind of like the training version of like a diet break with nutrition. And again, the difference is that for training, I think deloads are essential. For nutrition, I wouldn't say diet breaks are essential. And again, these tools are more helpful for people who are already starting in a place where they're relatively lean, right? You trying to get ready for a bodybuilding show. Yeah, using some refeeds, using some diet breaks would probably be pretty helpful every once in a while because you might feel really hungry. You might feel really fatigued, really tired. You might start to notice that as you get leaner, you're not able to regulate your body temperature as well, right? That's one thing that people struggle with. They can't fall asleep because they're feeling cold all the time. They're shivering. It's like, you're really lean. You're not eating a lot, right? But somebody who's overweight or obese, like these tools can be used, but they're just like not as necessary really.
And during a refeed, it's probably still important to like not let yourself like go off the rails entirely, or would you say that during that period, it really doesn't matter?
I wouldn't say it doesn't matter. I would say like everything is pretty nuanced, right? Because some people there are people that need to be very restrictive, at least for a period of time. And some people, if they, for example, go back to some of their eating behaviors, they'll just like completely revert back to their old behaviors, right? And perhaps that's the type of person that may not benefit as much from implementing a diet break versus someone else like myself. I'll use myself as an example. I know I have self-control. So if I'm dieting and I want to take a diet break and perhaps I want to eat some pizza and chips, like I'll allow myself to do that because I know that's not going to carry over to the following week, for example. Right. So I do think it's a per person or per individual situation that we have to address, right? I'd say for most people, obviously who are overweight or obese and are focusing on habit and behavior change, I do think it's important to continue to practice those behaviors even if you're on a diet break. Why? Because you're not going to be losing weight forever, right? At some point when you reach your goal, your goal is now to just maintain your new weight. And those diet breaks, those days of refeeding are really, really useful times where you could practice those behaviors. How do I just maintain my body weight? That's one of the reasons why I do like implementing some diet breaks with my clients on purpose, especially as you're getting closer to their goal. It's like, hey, now we need to learn how can you reintroduce a little bit more food, not go overboard, and maintain this new weight, right? Because if you just maintain a calorie deficit, you can't do that forever. You're just going to waste away essentially, right? You can't be in a calorie deficit forever is essentially what I'm trying to say. So you have to learn how to be at maintenance. And when you're at maintenance, if you're trying to maintain your body weight long-term, you have to focus on these healthy behaviors. And diet breaks, refeeds, etc., are a perfect opportunity to practice that.
What are some like strategies that you utilize when going from like a healthy weight within within that range of like being a healthy weight, but not necessarily shredded, to wanting to tighten up even just a little bit? Because I personally over the past couple months, and I've shared this on Instagram and elsewhere, I did like a little bit of a cut. Because for me,
you look great, dude.
Thanks, man. Thank you.
Seriously.
I appreciate it. I'm flattered. Keep flirting. No, I like it because I've said this on the podcast. Like, I don't really have an incentive. Like, I'm not an athlete. I'm not a bodybuilder. I'm not I don't make a living showing myself shirtless anywhere. So I was like, and I'm 40, so
Dude, you're 40?
I'm 40. Yeah.
That's unbelievable.
I just turned it like actually I'm close to 41. Yeah.
Dude.
Yeah. Thanks,
Good
man.
shit.
Thank you. Yeah. Fitness has been a lifestyle for me for as long as I can remember, since I'm 16, and I'm very interested in bodybuilding, but I've never wanted to be a bodybuilder. First of all, I don't have I couldn't be a bodybuilder. I don't think I have the genetics for it. And I've never really been that strong, but I was just like, after there was like a window after New Year's where I was spending a lot more time like in my own house, and I was like cooking for myself a lot more because like my brother has a new baby. One of my brothers has a new baby, and my other brother is wrapped up in his relationship land. And so I was just like, if I don't just like try it, like, I'm never going to do it. So I'm going to try to like drop a few percent body fat percentage points. And I went from like 14 to 15% body fat roughly, which is like 0 calorie tracking, but just being really mindful of food quality, which is like kind of my shtick,
Yep.
And
being physically active.
I love weight. I love lifting. Yeah. So I mean, like I'm very happy at that body fat percentage, but I was like, okay, let's see what I can do, and yeah, just over the past couple of months, I've gone down to like, I'm probably around like 10.5 to 11% body fat at this point. And it's been really interesting. So I'm just curious, like what are some typical like things that people can do, like once they're already eating a fairly high quality diet, to then go down even further.
So quick question for you.
Yeah.
What have you done?
Yeah. So this is my own experience, and feel free to like to chime in. But one of the things that I found to be really helpful, and I think a lot of people, it's interesting because I've talked and written in the past extensively about like the ketogenic diet, but I think probably it is because of my interest in brain health. And I think the ketogenic diet is like a very relevant and important thing to talk about within that context. But I'm not a ketogenic dieter.
Yeah.
And so one of the things that I actually did that people probably wouldn't expect from me is I cut dietary fat.
Okay.
Like the added fats, the added oils. And I kept carbohydrates relatively stable so that I could continue to have energy in the gym, because we know that carbohydrates, you store them in your muscle as glycogen. And so I cut a lot of like the added oils, like predominantly extra virgin olive oil, which I know is a very healthy food and I love it and I still use it, but I just like cut it back a little bit. I swapped a lot of the dairy products that I was using for like low fat, reduced fat dairy. Big fan of like fat-free Greek yogurt. And this is not meant to be like a long-term thing necessarily, but I did find like a lot of, I did see results from doing that, from cutting like dietary fat.
Were you tracking anything at all?
Over the course of the past couple months, I did track a few days because I just wanted like the mental exercise of doing it.
Okay.
Just so I could be able to speak to that when talking about this, publicly. But yeah, largely, I mean, I just keep track of like my protein. Yeah. Like I try to hit like 0.8 to 1 gram of protein per pound of my body weight. Yeah. And that's pretty much it. Like, I mean, yeah.
So you have a really good intuitive sense of your nutrition, right? I could kind of do the same as you, where like if I wanted to lose weight, I could easily by just making some small dietary changes. Essentially what you've done is made your diet less calorie dense by removing some fats.
Yeah. Oh, also, here's another thing that I did. I bought a very accurate food scale.
Okay.
And it weighs grams. So I used to have a food scale that was analog and it wasn't very accurate. Okay. But now I can weigh like my portions, which is like an auditing of like portion sizes.
So essentially you weren't tracking your calories, but you were weighing your portions.
Yeah. I did track a few days just to get a sense, to do an audit.
But would you say on a regular basis you track your portion sizes, for example?
Yeah, I do. I look at my portion sizes. Yeah.
Yeah. So you're tracking something.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
So I think that's an important topic to bring up because, as you mentioned earlier, the leaner you want to get, the more helpful tracking is.
Yeah, absolutely.
Because you have to be more precise. You have to be more exact. There's way less wiggle room.
Yeah, I would not refute that. Like, I think it's super valuable.
Yeah. So here's the thing. I think I want to talk about this in 3 different layers. One is, why do you want to get leaner? Right? Because so many of us want to get leaner just because, I don't know, we see people on social media who are really lean and it looks cool. Yeah. It looks fantastic, right? But people do not consider the sacrifices required to get leaner,
Hmm.
right? For example, I've talked about this extensively. Right now, I don't have a six pack. I've had a six pack before. I've been very lean before. The sacrifices required for me to be like that, although it looks fantastic, I don't want to make those anymore, right? I like going out to dinner with my wife without thinking about it too much, just enjoying food. We're going to go out to dinner tonight. We're just going to enjoy food,
Yeah.
right? You can't have that degree of flexibility if you're trying to get to like single digit body fat.
Yes.
Right.
Well, that's another thing is that I was during that period, I wasn't really eating out as much.
Yeah,
and when
exactly.
you eat out in restaurants, no matter what it is that you're eating, for the most part, it's going to be covered in like phantom calories from like added oils and sauces and
you're going to eat your whole meal.
Yeah.
Right. You're not going to like weigh the food at the restaurant. Some people do, but I don't think people should do that.
Right.
And you're just going to enjoy yourself. Right.
Yeah.
So when you partake in those behaviors frequently, which I do, it's not conducive towards being single digit body fat. And I understand that. And if I weigh the pros and cons, I'd rather not have a six pack. Now, let's say past that, you decide you want to have a six pack for whatever reason, and you naturally sit around 15% body fat, 14% body fat, which is really healthy, but you want to get down to 10 or 9. Well, then you have to be restrictive, right? I think some of the changes that you made are some of the similar changes that I make. For example, when I cook rice, I usually drizzle olive oil on it, right? If I simply want to cut back on my calories, just don't drizzle the olive oil on it, right? You're still probably going to have the same portion size. The caloric density is less. I'll usually have leaner sources of protein as well. I love 80-20 ground beef for burgers specifically, right? But that's a lot of fat essentially. So I'll cut down to maybe like 90-10 or like the 97-3, which is disgusting. I'm lying. I never eat that stuff.
No, I do 93-7.
Okay.
Yeah.
But there's even leaner than that. And that stuff, I don't know, man.
It's not great.
I don't like it. But I'm a food snob. So when it comes to stuff like that, I'm like, oh man, it doesn't taste good. I'd rather just have a little bit less of the stuff that tastes good. That's me personally.
Yeah.
My wife eats a ton of ground chicken and ground turkey. And I'm like, how do you eat that? But she likes it. Anyways, you can make these small dietary changes that make your diet less calorie dense. And I'm not going to use the word healthier here because it's not necessarily healthier, right? Like cutting out extra virgin olive oil from your diet is not.
No, extra virgin olive oil is great.
Exactly.
And
right?
as I've said many times, I don't want this to be misconstrued. This is like a temporary thing and I'm doing it for fun because I've never done it.
Exactly. And it goes to show calories matter besides food choices.
Yes.
Right? Because yes, it's a healthy food. But hey, if you want to get leaner, you have to cut your calories.
People always like on social media too, when I say that I'm like eating fat-free Greek yogurt, they're like, well, we know full fat is, and I've said full fat.
Yeah.
I've said many times, reach for full fat. This is temporary. I know that, but it's like a freaking fat-free Greek yogurt is like the protein shake of the yogurt world.
Yeah. Essentially,
You know?
yeah. Dude, if you've never done this, when you make a protein shake, put some Greek yogurt in it and just shake it up. It's tasty. Yeah, it's really good.
With water too?
Yeah.
Wow.
It just makes it a little bit more creamy.
Ooh,
it's good.
Interesting.
But I think some of the changes that you're talking about are perfect. And then, I mean, I really do think it's helpful to track calories the leaner you get. Understand you're going to feel hungry. Understand it's not going to be pleasant. But that's the goal you've set for yourself.
Yeah.
And that's really where, you know, when at least people in the fitness industry, they're like, you need to be more committed. You need to work harder. Those things are true if you're trying to get down to 7-8% body fat.
Right.
It's like there is really no way of doing it in an enjoyable fashion.
Yeah.
Some people are genetic freaks that are that lean year round. They're very lucky. Most of us aren't, right? And if you do want to have that, essentially, there are a lot of lifestyle related sacrifices that you have to make that you perhaps aren't willing to make. And again, that's every person's decision to make, right? Like if somebody wants that goal, if somebody comes to me with that goal, I usually ask them why. And if they're gung-ho about it, they know why they want to do it. I'm not going to tell them, hey, like, don't do that. It's silly. But I have talked to clients before who are like, man, I want to get leaner. And I'm thinking about one client here in particular. We had a conversation on the phone. I'm like, well, why? Right? And they're like, well, I don't know. I've just never gotten leaner. And I just want to try it out. And I'm like, and he's similar to me. He likes going out with his family for dinner. He travels a lot. He's a food snob. He likes going to nice restaurants. And I was like, understand that you might not be able to do those behaviors as much. Also understand that you're already really healthy. He's a muscular guy. Sure, he doesn't have a six-pack, but he's not overweight. His blood biomarkers are fine, right? That's one of the big things that I like to talk to people about. It's like, hey, if you get blood work done and everything's pretty good, if you want to get leaner, sure, but like, it's not going to make you any healthier necessarily, right? Like Max, you're not going to be any healthier because you drop 3% body fat. You're already really healthy, right?
Yeah.
And arguably, the leaner you get, the less healthy you'll be in
Yeah.
some instances because body fat's important.
No, I was under no misconception that this
Yeah.
was like going to be I just wanted to, I think I had the time and ability.
Yeah.
I realized
It's fun.
Yeah, it's fun. I recognized the barrier that like constantly eating out poses to being lean. And I was like, it was a period where I was just like, I've been eating home quite a bit lately.
Yeah.
So why not just like try to implement a few hacks and see where
Yeah,
it
yeah,
takes
yeah.
me, you know?
It also tests you psychologically,
Yeah.
right? Which is something fun to do every once in a while. I'm sure you've challenged yourself with like learning a new skill, or it's the same type of thing, right? When you
Amazing
learn,
point. Yeah.
when you learn a new skill, it's tough. It's not fun at first. But there's something rewarding about knowing that you have that level of discipline and like control over your body, and you can change your body as much as you want, right? That's one. So I recently made a post talking about like, hey, if you don't have abs, it's okay. If you're healthy, like, why does it matter? And somebody actually made a really good point in the comments, because I mentioned that I have been really lean before. And they're like, well, do you think you have this perspective because you have been really lean before and you understand both sides you've seen both sides of the equation essentially, right? And do you think it's helpful to perhaps pursue those things at least once in your life so that you understand what it's like? And I had never thought of it from that perspective. And I was like, yeah, I do think it's very powerful, because
It's like hearing a rich person say, money's not all that.
Yeah,
money's
yeah,
not the
yeah,
only
yeah,
thing
yeah.
that matters.
Yeah.
It's like,
Then
well,
give me
you're,
some.
you're
Give me
rich.
some.
Yeah.
But I was a very overweight kid. 12, 13, I was almost obese. And it was because, and again, this is where we talk about calories mattering. Yeah. I'm Cuban, so I come from a Cuban background. We eat pretty much whole and processed foods, a lot of rice, a lot of beans, a lot of protein. So pretty healthy foods. But I ate a lot, right? Because Spanish culture, it's also like, if I love you, I'm going to feed you. So my mom would feed me a lot, and I was pretty overweight. And I always felt insecure. And if I ever like went to a restaurant, ate a lot, I felt bad because I didn't feel like I had control, right? I will tell you this. The last time I got really lean was probably like 10 years ago. And since then, I've kind of just maintained this body composition. But I don't feel bad anymore because I know I have the skills necessary to lose body fat if necessary. And that's one of the things I share with my clients too. It's like, hey, understand that your weight may fluctuate throughout the year, right? The purpose of working with me as your coach, learning about some of these strategies, is not to lose weight and be the leanest you've ever been forever. One of the biggest things you're getting from this is having the skills, developing the skills to, if a couple months from now you gain 5 or 10 pounds, you know what to do to bring them down, right? That's something that is really, really valuable and really, really powerful. And you only get those skills by going through that process. So, I mean, you seem to have been a healthy guy pretty much your whole life. You've been active all the time, but perhaps this venture that you're going through of getting a little bit leaner makes you feel even a little bit more in control about your own body, right?
Yeah, I mean, I wanted to be able to speak to it. Like,
Yeah.
I wanted to have it as part of, I mean, I guess it's what you said. I wanted to develop the skills and see what it took
Yeah.
to just lean out like a little bit.
Yeah.
Also recognizing that like, I don't really have the incentive to do it. I was already healthy,
Yeah.
and so, yeah, for me, it was just a fun little experiment.
Yeah. And for somebody like you, like diet breaks,
Yeah.
refeeds may be a lot more helpful.
Yeah.
Right. Because you can also, let's say you want to get from 15 and you want to step on a bodybuilding stage and you want to get to like 5, 6%. It's tough, right? So maybe you go from 15 to like 12. You chill there for a couple of weeks. You start to develop the behaviors that are necessary to maintain 12. Once you feel comfortable there, you get from 12 to 10. And you just do it in a stepwise fashion. So in those instances, I do think things like refeeds, diet breaks are really helpful.
I didn't know you were Cuban. That's all. I love Cuban food, dude.
Dude, it's so funny that you just mentioned that because I think Cuban food is so bland.
What?
We don't use much. We don't use a lot of spice, and I like spicy. So you'll notice, and you might pick up on this more now when you eat Cuban food. It's a lot of garlic, peppers, onions, which are delicious. But like Mexican food has more spice to it, you know. I personally like spicy food, and my family, dude, if I cook for them a steak and I put black pepper on it, they think that's spicy.
Whoa.
So yeah,
dude, ropa vieja.
that is delicious, but that is actually more American than it is Cuban.
Is it?
You don't have a lot of beef dishes in Cuba because you probably don't know this. Killing a cow is illegal.
In Cuba?
Yeah, dude. Yeah, there's like this running joke that you'll get more years in prison for killing a cow than you do a person.
Whoa.
And it's just, I don't know the reasons why, like government monopoly over food scarcity essentially. But if you go to Cuba, like all the dishes are pretty much pork or chicken, some seafood. Seafood's also pretty regulated. So a lot of the Cuban dishes that are really famous are like more American than they are Cuban.
Oh my God.
Yeah.
Wow. Communism, man. Holy cow.
It's crazy, dude.
Literally. Leche Asado. That's, I mean, I do love that too.
Yes.
Yeah.
There's a great documentary on Netflix on the history of Cuba over the past like 60, 80 years. Highly recommend it. I'll share it with you after.
What's it called? Do you know the name off the top of your
I
head?
can't remember, but if you type in Cuba, it'll pop up. It's like one of the first documentaries. It's really good.
Wow. Super interesting stuff. How did you how did you decide this path? Like, how did you get into nutrition and decide to go the academic route?
I laugh, dude, because I've been asked this question multiple times, and I'm the type of person, I do not really like plan out far in the future. I kind of always just chase what I enjoy, see what options are available to me at the moment, and just like pick the best one. And I'm saying that, I'm prefacing what I'm going to say now with that, because that's essentially how I got to where I'm at today. So as a kid, both my parents exercised. So I liked exercise. And I wanted to lift weights from the time I was like 12 or 13. And so I got into fitness that way. And then a big part of my life was also music. Like we talked about, I played the guitar. I've been playing the guitar since I was like 10 years old, played the saxophone in high school. And going into college, let me back up a second. Another big passion of mine was cooking. So I like cooking, I like music, and I like lifting. But I didn't think like lifting or fitness could be a career at all.
We're very similar, by the way, but yeah, keep going.
So going into college, I actually originally wanted to be a music major. And I just wanted to play jazz. I wanted to play the saxophone, and that's all I wanted to do. I used to play the saxophone like 5 hours a day. I loved it. I still love it. It's just really freaking loud, and my neighbors don't love it. But I had a conversation with my mom one day, and she was like, that's not really a career you should follow. Like, you could just do that as a hobby. Anyway, she convinced me not to. And so then after that, I went to Florida State University. So we had what was called exploratory, where you didn't have to declare a major for the first 2 years. And so the first 2 years, I took a ton of classes, and I just like didn't really do too well. Because as we were talking about before, I'm the type of person that if I'm not really interested in something, I just don't really care about it. And I have a really hard time like focusing or putting attention towards something that just doesn't catch my interest, right? So I remember I failed this one class that was a writing class. And the reason I failed it, I was also very disorganized, unfortunately, which is something that's worked against me my entire life. But there was a final paper due. I submitted it electronically. And then like 2 weeks later, professor emails me. This was a completely remote class. So she emails me and she's like, I didn't get your submission. I was like, I know I submitted it. Anyways, I looked for it on my computer, can't find it. And she was like, I'll give you another couple of days to submit it. And I was like, no, it's okay. I don't really care. And I failed that class. And it was also because I had no direction. I didn't really even know what I wanted to do. And then going into like the end of my sophomore year, going into my junior year, I started taking biochemistry courses, organic chemistry courses, the courses that everybody hates. I really enjoyed them. So I was like, I know I'm going to do something with the science related stuff. What do I like? Nutrition, exercise science. So I declared my major to be exercise science. And now this is another situation where I was very irresponsible. There was an introductory class, Intro to Exercise Science, that was once a week on Mondays at 8 in the morning. As a 20-year-old in college, I could not wake up before 8 in the morning. Okay, so it was pass-fail, just attendance-based, and I didn't go for 3 weeks in a row. So I was forced to change my major. And the closest thing was nutrition. So I'm like, I'm just going to pick nutrition.
Wow.
Because I cared about food too. And then since then, I got my shit together essentially, and I didn't mess up nearly as bad. And honestly, when I started taking like hardcore metabolism classes, vitamins and minerals classes, I started enjoying it a lot more. And actually, towards the end of my undergrad career, I was way more focused on food science because our degree was nutrition and food science. And so it was a lot of like food engineering, food processing. I took a foods lab that I loved. We would all like cook the same thing, but with a slight modification in the recipe. So let's say we made a pie. Everybody would use a different type of sugar, and then we would taste it, evaluate it. So that was really fun. And I originally wanted to go into food science. And so getting towards the end of my undergrad career, I remember clearly I was in the library studying for an exam. I was like, man, I can't do anything with an undergrad degree in nutrition. What am I going to do? Well, I like school. I'm going to keep going to school. So applied for the master's program. Didn't have the GPA necessary because of my freshman and sophomore year, but I killed it my junior and senior year in all of like the hardcore classes. And the main professor in the food science department, he was, I'd say a close friend, and he was a really respectable professor in our college. And I had a conversation with him, and he essentially vouched for me to get into into the graduate program. So I started my master's with a focus on food science because I've always had like an entrepreneurial spirit too. And I wanted to like develop new food products. I wanted to develop like high protein snacks essentially.
Oh, wow. So cool.
That was like the first thing that came to mind. I was like, this is what I want to do. I want to use my master's to develop this. I didn't know what research was. I didn't know what a graduate degree was. I just like went to graduate school. And little did I know that the research that you do is essentially the research that your professor does, right? And at that time, we had 2 food science professors, one that I wasn't close with, one that I was working with, and the one that I was working with studied the allergens of tree nuts. So very important work, but not very exciting work. Right. So I was like, man, I need to get out of this lab because I'm not going to develop this food product. I'm going to do something else. And so I was taking a vitamins and minerals class in grad school. That's where I met my major professor for my PhD. And keep in mind, during my master's, I was paying out of pocket. My undergrad was paid for. Master's, I was paying out of pocket. First year, I took out like $30,000 in debt. I was like, damn, school is expensive. And so I was doing really well in this class. I was getting along really well with the professor. And he asked me one day, he goes, have you ever considered doing a PhD? Actually, I asked him if he would be my mentor. And he said, I only work with PhD students. Have you ever considered doing a PhD? And my answer literally was like, no, it's too expensive. Little did I know that your PhD is actually paid for from at most universities. They pay your tuition and they pay you a stipend because you're essentially an employee for the university. You're the teacher, you do research. And when he told me that, dude, keep in mind that I did not know what research was. I did not know what a PhD was. I did lightly, but I didn't know what a PhD was. And he was like, oh, no. We'll pay for your school and we'll pay you $25,000, which is nothing. But at that time, it was a lot of money for me. And I was like, yep, we're doing the PhD. That was my decision. That was it. And so throughout the PhD, I just like really started liking research, really started liking what I was doing, but I didn't like the academic environment at all. It's very political. There's a lot of like egoism involved, and it's all about who you know, what relationships you have, which the real life is like that too, but it's like very cutthroat. If you have bad relationships with the wrong people, good luck. That's literally how it is. Not just for promotions, but for publications, for your ability to actually conduct research. Like the people that are in charge of different aspects of academia can make it really hard for you to conduct research. And I saw all of this firsthand because my professor was essentially like the bad apple of the department and had bad relationships with everybody because he was very outspoken. He was a very honest man. And if something wasn't right, he would say it on the spot. He didn't care. So he didn't have good relationships with people. And I saw like how tough they made his life. He was already a tenured professor, so thankfully he could be outspoken, right? And he was also very transparent with us. He involved us in every aspect of academia from day one. So like writing grants, which is something you don't do towards the end. He involved me in all that stuff day one and really exposed me to what academia is really like, which most people don't learn till like the end of their PhD. So I knew pretty much like halfway through, I was like, I'm not about this. And I didn't really like, I think academia really attracts a certain type of person. And I just didn't feel like I meshed well with that type of person.
What is that type of person?
I don't like using this term, but in some senses, socially awkward, for example. It's hard to connect with a certain type. And I don't want to make this generalization because, for example, for my postdoc, I had an amazing experience with an amazing professor. But generally, that's kind of the experience that I had, at least in my department. And very competitive, cutthroat, right? Thankfully, I came from a lab where we worked as a team, which is what you should do and help each other. But most labs are very cutthroat. And also there is zero work-life balance. And that's the aspect that like I did not like, right? Because I'm the type of person like I want to work hard, but I want to play hard. I want to chill. I want to enjoy my life because like, what's life about if we're not enjoying our lives, right?
Exactly.
And so I saw these professors, especially when you first start, if you want to get promotions, if you want to be tenured, you have to be working like 12, 16-hour days on a regular basis for years. So there's no work-life balance. And there wasn't really a financial incentive either. Like when you start working as a professor, at least in the field of nutrition, you might start with a salary of like $65,000, $70,000, which is livable, but you've gone to school for a really long time. You can get that amount of money without going to school. And sure, money is not everything, but it does matter, right? So those were the main reasons why like I really wasn't about academia. And one more reason was something I didn't know. It's like the research that you do isn't necessarily just the research that you're interested in. It's the kind of research that will be funded, right? So for example, my professor studied nutrition. he got a lot of grants from the USDA to study the effects of prunes, dried plums, on bone health.
Interesting.
There's boron and there's other phytoestrogens in prunes that do have some beneficial effects on bone.
I started taking boron recently.
Yeah,
Yeah, because
cool.
it can it's like one of the few compounds that clinically it's been shown it can reduce like sex hormone binding globulin.
Yeah, and it's pretty rare in most foods.
Yeah.
So supplementation is smart.
It predominates in plant foods, and prunes and raisins are like some of the top sources.
Prunes are one of the top sources, yeah. And boron's important for bone health. But I'll tell you this, my professor was not interested in looking at that. It's like, there is funding for it. There is an opportunity to do this project. So we're going to do this project because it helps the lab, right? And when you're a tenured professor, you have more freedom. But when you're just starting off and you want to be promoted, you have to submit grants for things that you may not be super interested in because you need to get funding to get promoted, right? So all of those things really turned me off. And then, as you know, I now work with Lane Norton, and Lane was somebody who I've been following since I was in high school. And I've always been the type of person of like that thinks like, if you want something, just ask for it, right? You never know. So I reached out to him and I just sent him an email and I said, hey, I really admire your work. I've been following you for a while. Your career path is essentially the career path I want to take. You have a PhD in nutrition, but you're an entrepreneur. I want to do the same things. Can I work for you for free, essentially, like as mentorship? And this is one thing I really respect about Lane. He's always super receptive to help, particularly students, because he understands the struggle. And he doesn't like free work. So he could have literally used me for free work because I offered to work for free. He was like, no, I'll pay you. So that was something I really admired about him. And I started off when I was in grad school just writing evidence-based articles for his BioLane site. And then after school, he gave me a position coaching with his company. So I coach now. I also work as the scientific advisor for Outwork Nutrition, which is our supplement company. So anytime we're developing a new product, I'm the person who does the review on the ingredients, talk about what ingredients, what dosing, what claims can we make, what claims can we not make. So that's kind of my role with Outwork Nutrition. And that's pretty much what I do now, man. I'm also working on developing some courses related to nutrition and fat loss, how to develop a sustainable plan. I want to develop a course on resistance training for hypertrophy specifically. And so those are some of the endeavors I'm working on now.
Super cool stuff. Yeah, I mean, there's a lot to do, I feel like, in this field, but you just have to have like that entrepreneurial mindset.
Yeah, and just being patient and working on a little bit every day.
Yeah.
That's one thing I have a hard time with. And I've talked to my wife about this because I tend to put a lot on my plate, definitely more than I can handle sometimes. And then I just like get upset if I don't accomplish the things I wanted to accomplish. And I know I can be a little bit too hard on myself. So I've tried dialing it a step back, just like we were talking about with nutrition, small steps. Do the same thing. Just like have a daily minimum. For example, for my course, I'm trying to write the very minimum 300 words per day. Very realistic. I usually do more. But setting that daily minimum, I'm like, okay, I can do this. And if I do this 6 months, 8 months down the road, I can have the course written. Rather than like, I'm trying to write a chapter every day and then I don't, and then I get frustrated.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's great, man. Well, yeah, as I mentioned, your content, I think it's like, especially among like the academics that I've seen putting out content online, it's a breath of fresh air because it's like really positive and helpful. There's a lot of people I feel like that, I mean, it is the minority that are, that wield their credentials as like this, like, just like an air of authority that they use to like come out swinging against anybody and everybody that that tries to have a seat at the table.
Yeah.
Which I think is, I think there should be room for people from all different fields to come and have a seat at the table when it comes to discussing something as ubiquitous and integral to the human experience as food and nutrition.
Yes, you're completely right. I think, like we talked about, social media rewards negativity. I think there's a lot of positive aspects of social media. There's also a lot of negative aspects. I don't think we should attack particular people at all. It's something I've done before. It's something I try really hard not to do. Now, there are definitely some charlatans, right?
There definitely are.
For example, talking about everybody having a seat at the table. I don't necessarily know if I agree fully because there's times I've posted evidence-based things and people will comment some ridiculous stuff, right?
Yes.
Out of left field. And that person, like, they're not trying to have a nuanced discussion. They're just being outlandish, essentially.
Well, I guess, yeah, I would rephrase that. Maybe not everybody deserves a seat at the table, but I think that we do have to have room for people from outside
Yeah.
of our
Yeah.
respective fields. Because I mean, throughout history,
Yeah.
contributions have been made to fields by people from outside of them, by outsiders, right?
Yeah. Have you seen the documentary on Netflix, Ancient Apocalypse, or heard about it?
No, but I've heard of it. Yeah,
Okay.
I want to watch it. Graham Hancock, right?
Yeah, it's fantastic.
Hmm.
We'll talk about that after for sure. It's really cool. Joe and I were talking about it. Joe's my friend. But essentially, yeah, I do think we should be more open-minded. Just hear what people have to say. It's the same with like any topic, right? Politics, for example. Like
Yeah.
people with opposing views don't want to talk. And I do think there's a little bit more of a concrete aspect when it comes to nutrition where like there is evidence, like some things are right, some things are wrong, but there's a lot of nuance there, right? For example, a nuanced topic, and I actually really appreciate you for sharing my video about artificial sweeteners, right? Because we want to take this black and white approach to every topic, and nothing with nutrition is black and white, right? Artificial sweeteners, for example. Yes, there is a link between artificial sweeteners and the development of certain diseases. I don't think anybody would argue that drinking a diet soda is as healthy as drinking water. That's not what we're arguing. But the way social media is, like, you're rewarded for short little messages, right? The nuance is lost, right? Instagram, you can produce 60-second videos, TikTok, all that stuff. It's short form content. That's why I really enjoy this, because we can just talk about these things. But with the artificial sweeteners topic, you just get people saying, they're bad, they're bad, they're bad. Or no, they're not bad, they're not bad, they're not bad. And like the truth lies in the middle, right? Like it's not as healthy as water, but there's also really good research that not only does it help with weight loss, but it helps with weight loss maintenance. Why? Because it perhaps helps people curb their cravings, right? If you want something sweet, rather than having the sugary beverage, you can have the alternative, which is the one with artificial sweeteners, helps you reduce your caloric intake, perhaps helps you regulate how many calories you're consuming. And if you're somebody who has struggled with your weight and you lose weight, again, that's going to be a very beneficial thing for your health, right? So in some aspects, these artificially sweetened beverage can be helpful. Now, again, if it's somebody trying to optimize their health, like you, for example, and you want to avoid them because you know that it's not as good as drinking water, like I would never argue against that, right? But just when
like Max, you have to consume artificial sweeteners.
Exactly, right? That would be silly. I use them. Why? Because oftentimes I enjoy it. I like having the carbonation of a drink. Again, enjoyment is an aspect of it. And two, oftentimes like I have a sweet tooth. Like I don't want to eat this or something like that. And I'll just like have a little bit of Diet Coke or something like that. It's not going to have any huge, large detrimental impacts on my health. Do I agree that it's not as healthy as drinking water? Of course. But this nuanced discussion is what's lost in social media.
Completely.
Yeah.
Yeah, I enjoy, and especially while I've been sort of like tapering back my food intake.
Yeah.
I have enjoyed, I mean, I buy like stevia sweetened sodas, but it's like, or monk fruit sweetened sodas, just the same, but for the same effect.
Yeah.
Essentially. Yeah. And then some of these sodas, they have like caffeine, which I think probably has like an appetite suppressant effect as well. So yeah, I'm game. I mean, I personally choose to avoid artificial sweeteners, but that doesn't mean that like I'm doing so because I think that consuming a little bit here and there is going to give me any kind of like, I'm going to grow a third arm or something, you know?
Yeah. And it's important to note that most of these studies in humans are correlational, right? And there are people who dismiss correlational studies, and I think that's silly too, because a lot of things we can only study in a correlational manner. With nutrition, if you want to study the long-term effects of something, you can't really like control a group of people for 20, 30, 40 years, right? And the negative effects of some of these things perhaps are really only actualized after a long period of time, right? So correlational data is important. And yeah, correlational data show that there are some links. The links aren't super strong. They're not necessarily causative, but they're there. And I don't think we should ignore them either, right? So I think the appropriate message for artificial sweeteners, for example, it's like, hey, if you're somebody who is overweight or obese, this actually may help you slightly reduce your caloric intake, which might help you lose weight, which will be beneficial for your health. However, if you're trying to optimize your health, perhaps you have family history of particular diseases, particular types of cancer, and you really want to reduce your risk as much as possible, then yeah, you should probably avoid artificial sweeteners at all costs. I think that's the right answer to give. I don't hear that answer much.
I love it. Well, we love having these nuanced, evidence-based conversations on the Genius Life. So I just want you to, thank you for your time, for your expertise. This was super fun. Hey, if you liked that video, you need to check out this one here, and I'll see you there.
Are you exercising in the morning? That's the best time to exercise. Use that cortisol. Whatever you don't use of cortisol, you will store. And you store it as belly fat primarily.
Wow.
Now, let's extrapolate that into other times. What if you get a cortisol spike at 5 at night?